Soraya Chemaly, writer and activist. Soraya, how to fix democracy? Does democracy need to be fixed?
There's a presupposition that democracy wasn't broken, that it was intact to begin with. And for most people in the United States, I'd argue that that was never true. Certainly for women, it's a problematic proposition. Very recently in our history only have women been able to vote, have they been able to open bank accounts, have they been able to join the workforce in anywhere near parity numbers, and we still have a crisis in leadership. So I think that we need to really consider the interaction between women's inequality and all other forms of inequality, whether we're talking about race or ethnicity, because they're totally intertwined.
It's a cliche, of course, that American democracy was founded by white property-owning men, although, as with many cliches, it's true.
Mm-hmm.
Were the rules, the nature, the sort of the culture of American democracy from the beginning, was there something male about them?
I mean, undeniably male about them. I mean, it was rooted in a history of a sort of patriarchal capitalism, a patriarchal philosophy, patriarchal theology, whatever source.
Let me jump in here.
Yeah.
What do you mean by patriarchal?
So I would define that as male rule and the domination of men's experiences and thinking in how we define what it means to be human. Whether we're talking politically, philosophically, scientifically, our standard of understanding what is real and true and objective and relevant and serious and important and political comes from a very narrowly defined experience of a certain group of human beings. And that continues to dominate what we think of as serious and political and relevant and threatening. And I think that it's not only a legacy of patriarchal thinking, but a continuation. It creates itself, it constructs itself perpetually in our society. And we need to find ways to disrupt that in order to secure a true democratic society. I think some people think when they hear the word patriarchal, they think men. But in fact, it's society, right? And men and women participate in society, are socialized by the society, and practice the way they go about their lives in the ways that we're socialized. And the ways that we're socialized center men's experiences and center men's thinking.
I know you've also done a lot of work on the relationship between patriarchy and violence. How does the history of violence, particularly male on female violence, how does that fit into your narrative of American democracy?
So it's interesting. I would categorize it more as an ideology of masculinity and masculine violence. The conflation of masculinity with aggression and anger and violence and domination over others, which is, of course, not the only course for masculinity. There are many different ways to be masculine. It's just that certain ways of being masculine are weaponized or politicized more effectively than others. And so violence has always been part of our democracy, whether we're talking about slavery or violence against women.
Or the destruction of Native Americans.
For sure. I mean, if you look at the original colonization of the continent, even today we don't teach it that way in our schools. That's a type of, I hesitate to say a type of violence, but in fact it is a type of violence because we are not honest as a culture with our own history of violence and anti-democratic authoritarianism. And so if we start off with what was done to Native Americans and the fights that are enduring, I mean, Native Americans and indigenous people all over the world continue to fight for their rights, and it's very hard for them to be heard because they don't have access to the resources, and that's the legacy of centuries of oppression. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that we would have to be willing as a society to consider what it means to have this kind of violence be part of male identity.
Are you an American exceptionalist? Do you see the history of American democracy as being different from European democracy, or the themes that you think about and focus on, patriarchy, violence, oppression of women, are they as true in the United Kingdom or France or Germany?
Yeah, I'm not an American exceptionalist. I mean, I think no matter where you look in the world, even if you look, for example, at the Arab Spring, you see women in our history, certainly, in the United States. We see it all over Europe. We see it in Africa. We see it in South America. Women are always part of revolutionary movements. They are always centrally important to those. And then there's a course of history that takes place as there need to be systemization and institutionalization of setting the women aside, of setting their concerns aside, of not considering women as authoritative political actors. In times of crisis, which I would say we're in right now, women's voices are allowed to be heard by the society. So I've just written a book about anger, and women acting in anger are given a lot more leeway in times of political crisis. But there's almost always a backlash against that and a push for women to go back into their spaces, to be more silent, not to be actively involved in leadership and consolidation of power.
There are obviously many parts of the world where the position of women is, and you may disagree with this, but certainly more problematic than they are in the West, and certainly the Muslim world and the Middle East. What would you say to critics of some of the things you're saying, saying, well, all this stuff's all very well, but things are different now, and you have to go through that, and let's focus on the positive stuff, and let's not obsess over the discrimination in the past?
Well, two things. The discrimination is enduring. It's not even difficult to demonstrate that.
As bad now as it's ever been, or different?
In the United States?
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think things change, right? They tessellate into new manifestations, and people experience them in different ways. I mean, any of the major social issues that you might talk about today, politically, and I shouldn't even say social issues because I think they're all social issues ultimately. But any of those, they include the experiences of women as among the most affected always. So whether you're talking about climate change, the environment, economic gaps, all of those have to take into consideration what is happening to women. And yet what's happening to women is never taken as centrally, seriously defining of the problem. And so I would just say that, of course, there have been times when there was more egregious violence, but I think it's ultimately irrelevant. And I think that it's a red herring to say that. Very often what I'm told is, but women over there are being treated more poorly, so you should shut up. And that could
over there being?
Over there could be 6 miles away. It could be 6,000 miles away, because the point actually isn't what's happening to those women. It is that people who are indicating that there is a problem here should stop doing that. And in fact, what I hear in my head very often, because it's often part of the conversation, that we treat our women here better than they treat their women there. And so in the end, it's not about women at all, but about the relative merits of men in relation to women. And the result of that continues to be, internationally, that women's rights get traded, and they become bargaining chips. And we see that in our own politics, and we see it in global politics.
Of course, in 2016, we had the first female candidate for American president. She lost, but we have female prime ministers, many in Europe, in the UK, in Scandinavia, in Germany. Something's changed dramatically, hasn't it? Over the last, say, 100 years?
Oh, over the last 100 years, the major thing I think that has changed is that women have been educated. And for the last 100 years since they've been educated, they have done better than boys and men in school. And that has yielded little difference in the structures of society that would allow women to be paid equally and fairly, that would allow them to achieve levels of leadership with parity. And so, yes, women now make up the majority of students in colleges and universities. But in fact, that sounds so scary to some people when in most places, they are in universities and colleges with parity, because women are more of the population.
What's your reading of the Trump-Clinton election of 2016 in terms of, firstly, how far women have come, secondly, how far they still need to go, and thirdly, of course, the way in which Hillary was treated within the media and by certain types of men?
So I think the United States should actually sort of be embarrassed about the political reality of women and leadership. We just had an electrifying midterm in which more women were elected to Congress than ever before, but it's still less than a quarter of Congress. So it's super that that happened, but in fact, it should be that women make up at least, if not more than half of Congress. And what's really funny to me is that if you were to suggest that women make up 80% of Congress, which has been the minimum percentage of men in Congress for all of our history, people would be appalled. They'd be stunned, they'd be shocked, they'd be horrified that women would have that much power. And I sort of press people to think about what that means, because nobody gives it a second thought when it's men that have that domination of legislative spaces. So yes, it's better than it was, but in fact, it's not that much better than 1925.
But let's go back to the Clinton-Trump election of
Yes.
2016 as opposed to 2018. What did this ferocious assault on Hillary Clinton, what did it say about the challenge still for female political candidates? Was she assaulted, attacked, threatened with imprisonment and violence? Do you think much of that was associated with her simply being a woman or being a certain kind of candidate?
Well, I think it was a combination of things, and I think that a lot of people were taken aback by the virulent misogyny that was quite evident in the course of the election. Certainly, even symbolically in Trump rallies or online, you could really see this desire to degrade her, to hold her in contempt, to feel disgust about her very being. And I would say that's really rooted in a fear of women claiming power. I mean, Hillary Clinton was the most popular woman in American culture year after year after year after year after year. But the minute she pivoted and reflected true ambition, people turned against her. And I think that's because the presidency in particular is a symbol of a kind of fatherhood of the nation. And the idea that a man has to be president, that the president has to be, if you remember, broad-shouldered, right? Just coded words about what a president looks like. Does a person look presidential? Very few women look presidential to voters. And that has nothing to do with Hillary Clinton, other than she was a woman. There were many reasons why people might disagree with her political philosophy, but the disgust and the contempt and the anger and the fear are separate from those sort of reasons that can be rationalized.
To explain one thing, Soraya, which to me is still a fundamental mystery. Trump is self-evidently hateful of women on every level. And yet still, I don't know what it is, 35-40% of women voted for him.
That really doesn't mystify me. I mean, if your status is being challenged on one basis, clearly on the basis of gender, I mean, what Trump did is make it glaringly obvious to white women that they suffer from a form of inequality that is really unacknowledged because it's deeply intimate. It's economic, it's religious, and they live with it every day, whether they care to acknowledge it that way or not. And so if you have this very evident light shining on a status threat, then you leverage other forms of status. And so to me, the white women who voted for Trump were able to leverage racial status to offset perceived threats of gender status. And we tend to think of intersectionality as, queer people or black women, but white women have also intersectional identities, and we ignore that at our peril. I mean, if you are a white woman and you are Catholic or evangelical, two major voting blocs for Trump, you are living in a system that in theory is complementary and equal, but in practice is really not, because it's a system in which women trade protection, either economic or physical protection, for ceding public power. And that is what the Republican Party has become. The representation of women in the American GOP is the same as it is for a hybrid authoritarian nation like Mali.
Wow. Mali in the US, similar?
No, they rank exactly the same way if you just look at women in the Republican Party as leaders.
This is a series entitled How to Fix Democracy. So in terms of the stuff you're talking about, the discrimination against women, this sort of atmosphere of violence that still hovers over political life and cultural life, the role of technology and the internet in this, how do we fix it? Do we just switch the internet off? Do people need more education? Should men still be allowed to vote? What are the solutions?
So I think of it short-term, mid-term, long-term.
Good.
I think
so let's start.
Can we start with long-term?
No, let's start with short-term, because then we can end on the long-term, which I think is always the most interesting.
Sure. So I think short-term, we need media to genuinely embrace inclusivity at all levels of leadership and production and management. Because what happens is we end up with systems justifying organizations. We end up with media that have cognitive blindness and then are caught off guard. So if you think right after the election, there was a lot of shock in elite media circles that Trump had won. The people that were not shocked were black people, and particularly black women, 99% of whom did not vote for Trump. And so
that's a really interesting point.
Well, I mean, the fact, like the Women's Media Center that I am part of, every year for...
Where's the center?
The center is here in Washington, D.C.
Right.
And the Women's Media Center conducts studies, a sort of demographic census of media every year, year over year. And it's kind of depressing, actually, because in fact, in terms of ownership of media, management of media, C-suites, editorial departments, there is a remarkable stubbornness that is, I think, the result of more than just media, but our general approach to work and life, that makes these incredibly homogenous spaces.
Any bright spots there? I mean, you can point out the problems.
In media, yes.
Yeah, I mean, give me some examples of online publications or magazines or media companies that are trying to do things different.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many media companies. I think it's more important, though, that even though we've been talking about the negative aspects of the internet, it has had a truly transformational impact on people's abilities to shape narrative. And
Me too, essentially.
Me Too. And Me Too, to me, is actually the current end point, Me Too and Time's Up, of a long continuum, a sort of hashtag genealogy, in which women, some men, but mainly women, were for the first time able to tell their stories in enough numbers to be heard and possibly believed. So if you start off with Yes, All Women, or hashtags like Everyday Sexism and Fast-Tailed Girls and Shout Your Abortion, these are stories of women's experiences day to day that in the past had to be run through gatekeepers, that they were often shrouded in shame or penalty. And the internet has enabled women globally to coalesce in these ways around these fundamental narratives. So even 30 years ago, a girl or a woman who had a story like that to tell could effectively be isolated by her community or her family or her school. That's no longer true.
Good. So we have the internet as a sort of an agent of democratization when it comes to our sense of gender and gender power. That's the short term. What about the medium term?
I think we really need to think long and hard about what we do with technology as it exists today. What we are faced with is a world of the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence, augmented reality, virtual reality. I think they will suffer if we do not disrupt the development of this technology. I think they will suffer from the same failure to assess risk adequately that we see in the internet today.
So are you saying that something like AI may take a a male form? I mean, obviously these are issues outside gender,
yeah,
which
it's
have
not just that.
great implications for humanity. But from the point of view of gender, is technology both a solution and a threat?
Oh, it's a solution and threat in every way, I think. I mean, if we even look at what we already know about AI, we know that it is rampantly reproducing bias at scale with great scope. So if you think about Google tagging pictures of black people as apes, if you think about the fact that all virtual assistants have female voices and can't say no.
But as a fix, so we know the problems. What's the medium-term fix here? Is it women running Google? Is it women engineers?
Well, no, actually, because I think women probably suffer from exactly the same types of biases. I think that we need to, and this gets us to the long term, think about education, early childhood education. We need to think about digital citizenship. We need to think about how we socialize children. I mean, it's very, very clear that, to me, that we are in the throes of a serious backlash against the change of mid-20th century change. And that in the United States
You mean the shift from an industrial to a digital economy that
but also social
changes in the nature of work?
The civil rights movement, the women's liberation movement.
Yeah. I sometimes fear, though, that when we get to the long term and people talk about education, they're really throwing up their hands and saying, well, we know there's a huge problem. We really have no idea how to deal with it, so we'll just shove it off to schools. We already have enough of a problem. Do you have examples of schools doing things differently, models, maybe Waldorf or Montessori?
In the United States?
Yeah. Who's beginning to address, which kind of schools are beginning to address these issues?
I think there are educators thinking about these issues, and I think there are individual teachers.
Models, examples? Give me a couple of people who are doing this.
Oh, trying to think of names. About 4 years ago, we had, I participated in something, it was a symposium called Social Justice in the Classroom, and there were maybe 180 teachers that came and participated and then went back to their schools. And I will say that what was striking to me about that was that these teachers didn't reflect a widespread institutional commitment. These were individuals who felt that this was important. And I think that by and large we're still at that stage. I think that schools have some of the same fears about technology that they have, for example, about sex. And that sex and tech are bad, but in reality it's the culture that frames the way we think about sex and tech that we have to tackle. And I think a lot of schools are in the thrall of parents and money and public debate about the role of public education. I mean, we're in the middle of that now, right?
So finally, Soraya, let's say some of this stuff happens, especially in the long term, and we do really kind of do away with gender as something that corrupts democracy. What would the world look like, very briefly? What could we be excited by the middle, say, of the 21st century?
Well, I'll paint a utopian picture from my perspective.
Well, that was the invitation.
Yes, thank you. I don't get that invitation very often. I think the world would look healthier in terms of actually the planet, but also people. And I think it would be a more humane place for individuals to live freely without fear of violence and with dignity. We don't, in the United States, prioritize dignity. Not in our free speech ideology, not in our market ideology, not even really in most of our educational ideals. And so to me it would be a world that valued human dignity more than it does now.